Well, I suppose this is the strangest family dinner we've ever had.
Have you ever heard a cry for help and been unable to do anything? Evelyn has. And for 30 years afterward, she didn't have a single peaceful night's sleep. In the spring of 1994, near the melting edges of West Glacier, Montana, where ice-fed streams slice like invisible blades, Evelyn Hartrow heard a sound she hadn't heard in over 30 years, a cry for help. But this time, it wasn't human. A massive figure, nearly 8 feet tall, was being dragged under by the freezing current, its eyes wild, terrified, and unmistakably aware. Evelyn, once a search and rescue dispatcher who had failed to save a child long ago, made a choice, one she didn't hesitate to make. She dove in. What she pulled from the icy river was not just a creature. It was a question, a second chance, a life caught between two worlds. She called him Bracken, and when the others came, towering figures hidden in shadow, with eyes like firelight and silence like judgment, Evelyn stood her ground. Not with weapons, with kindness. Because this isn't a story about monsters. It's about what happens when one act of mercy echoes across an entire forest. So now, dear listener, where are you watching from? What's your name, and how far can this story travel if we share it together? From our little corner of the woods to yours. Thank you for being here. If this tale stirred something in you, leave a like, hit subscribe, and join us as we build a quiet, kind-hearted community of Bigfoot believers. Let's keep the fire going. The wind dragged its cold teeth through the trees, pulling mist low across the river rocks and slicing the silence that blanketed the West Glacier Valley. Ice water rushed through the narrow cut in the land like it had somewhere to be, loud, sharp, and bitter with the melt of late spring. Evelyn's boots crunched against the gravel path above the stream bank, her eyes narrowed against the sting of the wind. She paused, squinting at the water. Not because of what she saw, but because of what she heard. There it was again. It wasn't the sound of water. Too irregular. Not the groan of ice breaking. It came jagged and desperate, buried beneath the roar like a plea that didn't know how to ask for help. A choking, almost human sound, like someone being pulled under. She stood very still. Lainey, just a few steps behind, was dragging a canvas bag through the brush, muttering to herself about camera placement and broken branches. The teenager hadn't heard it. Evelyn lifted one gloved hand slightly to quiet her, gaze fixed on the river below. Her breath came out in steam, but her face didn't move. Then it came again, a cry. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakably alive. Her stomach turned. That sound, it hit somewhere behind her ribs. Familiar. Not in memory, but in the place where memory hides. She had once heard a man die over a radio line, gurgling blood and frost-bitten words. That sound had lived in her bones ever since. Evelyn moved, quick, precise. She handed Lainey the bag, voice low but certain. "Stay up here." "What?" Lainey blinked. "Why?" "Now." The girl went quiet. Evelyn's tone didn't leave room for argument. She scanned the bank for a safe descent, eyes measuring angles and flow, then dropped her pack and pulled the coil of rope from the side pocket. Her fingers, already cold, worked fast. She found a branch lodged under a snowbank, thick, weathered, half frozen, and yanked it free. It was heavy. Good. She looped the rope around its base, tied off a hitch, and gripped it like a makeshift shepherd's crook. Then she saw it. A dark form thrashing mid-current, not quite above the surface. Arms, yes, arms, flailing, heavy limbs smacking the water. It looked massive, too big to be a man. At first, her brain shouted, "Bear!" Then her eyes caught the shape of the face. Not bear, not elk, not human either. She didn't have time to make sense of it. Evelyn skidded down the bank, snow crunching beneath her weight, her boots catching on slick moss and damp rock. Lainey shouted something behind her, worried, but distant. Evelyn's world had narrowed to this moment. The river was not wide, but it was furious. Spring runoff. The kind that didn't ask. It simply took. She stepped into the edge of it and sucked in air between her teeth. The cold hit like knives, sharp, fast, everywhere. Her breath fogged and vanished. The water climbed up her shins, her thighs. When it reached her waist, her skin felt as if it would split open. She held the branch out across the current. "Take it," she whispered, though her voice couldn't have reached over the roar. The figure flailed again, catching sight of her, and one massive, trembling arm swung out. Claws, fingers. It didn't matter. They missed. She adjusted her footing, almost slipped, and drove her boots deeper between two stones. Then she tried again. Extended the branch further. The figure reached, grasped, caught. Evelyn's shoulder wrenched with the weight. It wasn't dead weight. It moved, struggled, fought. But it was so damn heavy, she thought her spine might twist. She didn't pull. That wouldn't work. She leaned, let the current press her back, used the angle of her stance to inch backward, dragging the branch and the creature toward the shore. 1 foot. 2! It worked. The thing thrashed once more, then collapsed face down in the shallows, coughing hard, choking on river water. It was on land, barely. Evelyn stumbled back, panting. Her hands shook so hard she dropped the rope. Laney was on the slope above, halfway down now, trying not to slip. "Stop!" Evelyn called hoarsely. "Stay up!" "But you're—" I said stay. The girl froze. Evelyn turned back toward the thing lying half on the gravel bar. It was covered in thick, dark fur, soaked now, matted with grit and ice. Its chest rose and fell with a ragged rhythm. Steam curled from its mouth. Its shoulders, massive under all that hair, quivered with exhaustion or pain. She stood still. It opened its eyes. Amber. Not yellow, not red. Deep, old amber. Like something pulled from tree sap after centuries. And the expression behind them wasn't animal. It was confusion. It was pain. It was awareness. Evelyn didn't move. Her fingers were numb. Her coat was soaked through at the bottom, water dripping from the hem. The cold was crawling into her bones. Still, she didn't run. The creature did not growl, did not bare teeth. It just looked at her. Chest heaving, eyes fixed. Then it turned its head slightly, and she saw its arm. The gash was deep, torn open along the forearm, muscles twitching. Its side, too, bruised and swelling. The ribs looked wrong, either cracked or barely holding together. Blood, thick, dark, mixed with mud along its flank. Evelyn crouched slowly, pulled kindling from her pack and the dry moss from beneath her coat's lining. She struck the flint with practiced hands. A spark, then flame. She built the fire fast. The creature watched her, but didn't interfere. She set the flame between them, just close enough for heat, just far enough to keep the line clear. Then she sat back on her heels and breathed. Laney finally stepped closer, cautiously. Her boots scraped rock. "Is it—" "I don't know," Evelyn murmured. The creature was watching the fire now, and breathing. The flames flickered against its face, throwing light into the dark ridges of its brow. Its chest still heaved, but slower now. Evelyn could see its breath rising in plumes. Then she looked past it. Tracks, in the soft, thawed mud up the bank. A set of prints. Not the ones it had left. These were different, broader, heavier, deeper, and headed away. Someone, or something, had been here before. She stared at the prints, her mind clicking into patterns she couldn't quite hold yet. This wasn't a random drowning. It wasn't just an accident. She looked back at the creature. It hadn't taken its eyes off her, and in those amber depths there was no hatred, no threat. Just the quiet, dazed look of something that had been seen, but not hunted. Evelyn said nothing more. She just added wood to the fire. Behind her, the wind began to shift again, brushing through the trees like fingers through wet hair. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and shadows moved closer. Lainey wrapped her arms around herself and stepped closer to her grandmother, her breath hitching. Should we tell someone? Evelyn's eyes stayed on the flames. No, no one would believe it, and if they did, they'd come with guns. She looked at the creature one last time. The firelight caught in the soaked strands of its fur, making it glisten. It was breathing easier now. It hadn't tried to run. It hadn't tried to fight. It had simply survived, for now. In that hollow space between fear and understanding, Evelyn sat in silence and listened to the night begin, and somewhere, past the trees, something else listened back. The fire still burned low in the fading dusk, spitting softly against the cold, damp air. The forest had a way of swallowing light, pulling it down into its belly like it was trying to protect something. Shadows drifted across the trees, deepening into silhouettes, and the only movement was the slow curl of smoke rising between them. Evelyn sat with her knees pulled in, coat wrapped tight, eyes fixed on the edge of flame. She didn't speak, didn't shift, just listened. The air was too quiet. No bird song, no crickets, just the soft crackle and the distant pulse of river water moving over stone. Lainey leaned against her side, silent, watching with a wide-eyed stillness only a child trying to understand the rules of something older than words could manage. Then came the knock, dull, distant, like someone had struck two logs together far off in the woods. Once, then silence. It didn't echo, didn't repeat, but it sank into the bones. Evelyn's fingers twitched. She didn't look toward the sound, just closed her eyes for a breath. She knew the difference between the randomness of branches falling and something meant. The knock had rhythm. She opened her eyes and glanced sideways. Bracken was still there. He hadn't moved far from where she'd pulled him from the river. The creature sat low on its haunches just beyond the firelight, steam still lifting from its soaked fur, which now clung to its massive frame in stiff clumps. The wound on its arm looked worse now that it was dry, torn, dark, curling at the edges like scorched hide. Evelyn knew infection when she saw it, but Bracken wasn't looking at the fire. He was staring into the trees. Something in his posture shifted, head tilted slightly, breath slow and deliberate. Then, as if answering some silent instruction, he made a sound. Low, barely above a breath. A grunt that held a single note. Measured, purposeful. Evelyn didn't know how she knew, but she felt it. That noise. It answered the knock. This wasn't chaos. This was language. Bracken slowly lowered his injured arm, inch by inch, like he didn't want to draw attention to it, the way a man might hide a broken wing from the rest of the flock. Evelyn reached for the tin pot beside her, still warm from the earlier boil. She had filled it with melted snow, brought just past steaming, and she held it steady with both hands as she leaned forward. Not too close, not too fast. She set it down just inside the edge of warmth, then pulled back. Bracken watched, didn't flinch. His eyes scanned her movements carefully, methodically, not with suspicion. More like study, like he was cataloging behavior, reading intention. Lainey pulled a piece of jerky from her coat pocket, dried trout from the morning's catch, and broke it in half. She looked to Evelyn, who gave a small nod. Then the girl leaned forward and placed the two pieces on a flat rock near the fire. Still no words, just motion, just offering. Bracken's breath deepened. Then, with a slowness that felt ceremonial, he shifted his weight forward. Not a step, just a lean. One arm touched the earth, then the other. His fingers, not paws, not hooves, but long, heavy digits with nail-dark tips, reached out and hovered over the rock. Then, without a sound, he took the food. He didn't scarf it, didn't tear. He brought it close and sniffed, head tilting slightly before lifting it to his mouth and chewing with deliberate patience. Lainey didn't breathe. Neither did Evelyn. Night dropped hard after that. The kind of dark that makes you forget the sky ever held color. The fire became a boundary, soft orange against the void. The wind rose, weaving through the trees like it was looking for something. Evelyn leaned closer to the flame, hands out, not for warmth, but steadiness. She turned the edge of the bandage roll in her pocket. Clean cotton. The iodine had been poured into a tin lid, ready. She knew the gash needed to be flushed. She knew waiting would bring rot. But she also knew what it meant to cross the line too fast. So she waited. Bracken shifted again. More of his body angled toward the heat. Not a full move, but a lean of trust. She watched him look at the wound, then at her, then away, like he understood. She pulled the cloth free, slowly, held it up, showed the iodine cap, placed both beside the pot, then retreated. Bracken didn't come forward, but he didn't retreat either. He held his arms slightly aloft, keeping the wound angled away from the fire, almost reverent, like he didn't want to pollute the space with pain. Evelyn felt something stir beneath her ribs. She'd seen that look before, on the face of people about to die who didn't want to scare the people trying to help them. The silence of the woods thickened. Then, without warning, there was a flicker of light between the trees. Small, fast, gone. Laney turned sharply. "Did you see that?" Evelyn nodded once. A pair of eyes, just for a blink, had glinted back from the brush. Too tall to be a raccoon, too still for a deer. It had watched, then vanished. Another knock. 3. Space. 1. Bracken grunted again. Same tone, same rhythm. Evelyn felt her scalp prickle. This wasn't an animal cry. This was patterned, structured, like dispatch codes on the old radio system. You could say everything you needed with tone, number, pause. She remembered nights listening to forest rescue calls, when words failed and numbers carried the meaning. The way a double beat meant fire. A silence after the third meant death. She looked at Bracken and didn't feel afraid anymore. She felt like she was listening to something she was never meant to hear. And she listened. Bracken didn't sleep. He didn't curl or lay flat. He sat near the fire in a half-rest, one leg folded, the other braced, like he'd learned to doze without ever being defenseless. He turned his back slightly against the wind, not from need, but to block it from the flame. Evelyn noticed. A gesture, a decision to protect. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, low to herself, and reached into her coat. She pulled the folding knife from her inside pocket. Old blade, handle worn from decades. It wasn't a threat. Not now. She didn't open it, just turned it once in her palm, then drove it into the earth beside her, spine outward, hilt firm in the dirt. Not an offering, not a defense, just a presence, a totem, a marker that said, "I am here. I will not run." Laney huddled against her side, fingers in her coat sleeves, eyes wide but no longer frightened. She whispered, "Do you think he has family?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked across the fire, past Bracken, into the void between trees. And in that space, for just a heartbeat, she thought she saw a larger shape shift behind the black. Not moving closer, just standing, waiting, maybe judging, maybe deciding. She didn't point it out to Laney. Instead, she reached one arm around the girl's shoulders and pulled her in tighter. She whispered, "Sometimes the woods don't want to be understood. They want to be respected." The girl nodded without speaking. Somewhere beyond the fire, another shape passed between the trees. It didn't come close, but it didn't walk away either. The wind changed again. The smell of pine thickened. The fire hissed as a fresh branch crackled in its core. Evelyn sat still as stone, and the forest watched back. By morning, the cold had dulled to something manageable, but the weight in Evelyn's chest hadn't lifted. The fire had burned low in the hours before dawn, leaving only coals and a faint circle of ash. Bracken had moved sometime before first light, not far, but out of sight, leaving behind a damp hollow in the moss and a few blurred impressions in the soft earth that would be gone before noon. Evelyn stood at the edge of the clearing, hands deep in her coat pockets, staring toward the tree line. The air smelled like thawed bark and old snow. She didn't call out, didn't whistle or make noise. Whatever this fragile truce was, it wasn't built on noise. She just looked until the wind shifted, then turned away. Lainey sat cross-legged near the pack, still chewing the last of a biscuit, scribbling quietly in her field notebook. She looked up when Evelyn moved toward her. "I need you to head back into town today," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't hard, but it didn't invite argument. "Alone?" "I'll follow the road," Lainey said. "Like you showed me. You remember what to get?" "Gauze, more iodine, jerky, tea, that weird salve you like." "Good." Evelyn knelt, adjusted the straps on Lainey's pack, checked the knife on her belt. Her hands hesitated for a second longer than usual. "I'll be back before sundown," the girl said. Evelyn nodded once, then rose without another word. Lainey started walking. Evelyn watched her until the trees took her. The truck waited at the old trailhead, caked in dust and pollen. The drive into West Glacier wasn't long, but it peeled layers off the wilderness like old bark. The moment you hit the edge of pavement, you could feel the hum of man-made things buzzing underneath everything. Lainey turned on the AM radio out of habit. Static. Then a faint gospel tune. She let it play. The town itself hadn't changed. Gas station, bait shop, cafe with too many antlers and not enough windows. She parked by the general store and swung her legs out, dust rising in soft clouds beneath her boots. The bell over the door jingled like always. Inside, shelves stood stubborn and unchanged. Mason jars of candy that looked like they'd outlived 2 presidential terms. Flashlights that barely worked. Boxes of rice and canned soup lined up like they were waiting for the end of the world. She moved through the aisles quickly, grabbing gauze and peroxide, a cheap wool blanket, more crackers. She hesitated at the tea shelf, then grabbed the one with the faded label Evelyn always picked. Lainey didn't know what was in it, just that it smelled like dried lemons and thyme. Voices carried from the front counter. "Saw him myself, right by the trailhead, big as a dinner plate. Could have been moose prints." "Moose don't walk on 2 legs, do they?" Lainey paused, holding the blanket tighter. She peeked around the aisle. 3 men stood clustered near the coffee urn, their paper cups steaming in lazy spirals. One of them wore a baseball cap too tight for his head. Another had binoculars around his neck and a patch on his jacket that said something about elk. They were all laughing, but not like it was a joke, more like they were warming up to something. Then a voice cut through the air, deeper, slicker. "If there's something in the woods, we've got every right to know about it." Lainey turned slowly. Duke Ralston. He leaned against the front counter like he owned it, one boot hooked under the edge, a stack of photocopied flyers in his hand. His face held a half smile, all teeth and no warmth. "Could be something big," he said, passing out the flyers. "Could be worth a hike. Hell, might even be worth a photo or 2. The men chuckled, but their eyes were hungry. Lainey kept walking, heart thudding in her throat. She paid in cash, didn't wait for a bag, didn't speak. Outside, she nearly bumped into Ross Kellen. The deputy looked older than he did last fall. Maybe it was the uniform, or the way his eyes scanned everything now, like they didn't trust stillness anymore. He nodded at her, but something flickered behind his expression. "You and Evelyn been out by the old gulch?" he asked. Lainey tightened her grip on the bag. "We've been doing species counts, trail cam work." He raised an eyebrow. "See anything unusual?" She shrugged. "Depends on what you call unusual." Ross studied her. "Just be careful." Lainey gave a thin smile and slipped past him, back into the truck, heart still thumping. She didn't speak until the town was miles behind her. By the time she returned to the clearing, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the treetops gold. Evelyn was crouched by the fire ring, coaxing flame from damp wood. Lainey dropped the supplies beside her. "There's talk," she said. "Town's already buzzing. Duke's stirring things up." Evelyn didn't look up. "I figured. He's passing out flyers. Says he's organizing a hike." "Armed?" Lainey hesitated. "Didn't say, but he had that look." Evelyn stood slowly, cracked her spine. "He always has that look." They unpacked in silence. The fire took. The light warmed the stones. Later, when Lainey drifted to sleep near the flame, Evelyn walked the perimeter. Quiet, purposeful. She found it near the bend, a tree marked with a fresh line. Sharp, shallow, horizontal across the bark. Not a claw mark, not natural. She touched it, fingers brushing the edge. It was a hunter's mark, directional, recent. Her mouth went dry. They were close. Too close. When she returned to camp, Bracken was waiting. Not near the fire, but visible, standing between the trees like a shadow that had forgotten to hide. His breath came slow, his stance steady. But his eyes held urgency. He stepped aside slightly and pointed. Not with fingers, but with his body. Angled, deliberate. Behind him, barely visible in the soft mud, were marks. Arranged, left on purpose. Not words, but a map. Evelyn understood. She met his eyes. "You're not hiding from me," she whispered. "You're hiding from them." Bracken didn't move, but he didn't have to. She understood. The fog had thinned by midday, peeled away by sun and wind until only a fine mist clung to the creek edges like breath that refused to leave. Evelyn moved slow that morning, not because she was tired, but because everything in her told her to approach the clearing with respect, not speed. The path curved through fir and cedar, soft with damp needles, and the air carried a silence that wasn't quite empty. Not dangerous, just watchful. She stopped at the edge of the place where they had last made fire, set the cloth sack down, took one step forward, then another. There was no sound from the brush, no rustle, no movement, but she felt it, that weight in the air, that sense of being observed from behind a veil. She crouched and pulled the wool blanket from the sack, then gauze, salve, dried salmon wrapped in wax paper. She arranged each item near the fire ring like setting a table for someone who might arrive but wasn't owed the invitation. Then she stood up, backed away, not far, just enough to leave space. Lainey stood a few yards behind her, hands tucked into her sleeves. She didn't ask what they were waiting for. She already knew. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then something shifted. The light beneath the trees changed. The edges of the clearing stretched longer shadows. And from between two spruce trunks, Bracken emerged, quiet, steady, not hiding. He stepped just into the dappled light. Not into the sun, not into the open, just far enough that they could see him. He looked thinner, not from hunger, but from healing. The wound on his arm had started to close, tight and dark. His breathing had steadied, but there was still a limp in the way he balanced weight. His eyes flicked from the supplies to Evelyn, then down to the ground. He didn't cross the fire ring. He just stayed where he was, half in, half out. Lainey nudged Evelyn gently and pointed. Near the fire, to the left of the rock where they'd laid food before. Prints. Smaller than Bracken's, less deep. A second set, and off to the side, another. A third. Lainey looked up, her voice low, uncertain. "There's more." Evelyn didn't speak. Then, behind Bracken, a shadow moved. It stepped into the edge of the clearing, not rushing, not stomping, but with the kind of purpose that made your bones go still. Taller than Bracken, broader, covered in dark, coarse hair that caught the light like old tree bark. The shoulders were squared in a way that felt almost military. Not in uniform, but in command. It didn't grunt, didn't blink. It simply looked straight at Evelyn. The warden. She didn't know how she knew that's what he was. There was no title, no mark, but something in the posture, in the patience of that gaze, told her this was not just another member of the group. He wasn't watching for danger. He was weighing decisions. He was a threshold. Evelyn took a slow breath. She didn't lift her hands, didn't bow, didn't move. Then, without speaking, she crouched deliberately and removed the knife from her belt. She didn't hold it out, just placed it spine down into the dirt at her feet. A signal, not surrender, not fear, just a marker. She stepped back half a foot. The warden didn't nod, didn't respond, but he saw. He took one step forward. That was all, one step into clearer light. Then he bent slightly and used one broad foot to smooth over the smaller prints behind Bracken. A protective gesture, not erasing, shielding. Lainey watched, wide-eyed. Her fingers gripped the edge of Evelyn's sleeve. Then crack, a dry snap of sound from the east. Not loud, but sharp. The warden's head turned. Bracken shifted. Evelyn felt it in her chest before she understood it. Gunfire. Far, but not far enough. She turned her body toward the sound instinctively, placing herself slightly in front of Lainey. Another sound. Louder this time, a crack like a warning. Then nothing. Bracken stepped between them. Not fast, just firm. A line drawn without words. Evelyn stared at the back of him, heart ticking louder. Bracken stood tall, wounded side angled away, and faced the direction of the sound. The warden had not moved, but something in the forest shifted again. A current beneath the surface. A subtle tightening. Lainey whispered, "Are they coming here?" Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't know yet. Bracken's eyes tracked the treetops. He tilted his head once, as if listening for something just out of reach. Then Evelyn saw the line of tension ripple through his shoulders. He wasn't preparing to run. He was preparing to block. The warden finally moved. Not fast, just a turn of the head, toward Evelyn. And in that brief, flickering moment, Evelyn understood the test. This wasn't just a meeting. It was an assessment of what she would do, of how she would react. She reached for Lainey's hand and slowly, carefully, guided her backward. Not turning, not running, just stepping. Bracken didn't move, but his chest rose with the kind of breath that sounded like the beginning of a decision. The shot hadn't been close, not yet, but it had been too close to ignore. The warden's gaze stayed fixed. Then, just like that, he turned, melted back into the trees like smoke. Gone. Bracken looked back at Evelyn once, then followed. Not quickly, not afraid. Just done. Evelyn stood there a moment longer, the sound of wind curling around her boots. She glanced back toward the ridge. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew. They weren't just being watched anymore. They were being hunted. That night, by the fire, she wrapped Lainey in the blanket and stared into the flames. She couldn't sleep, not because of fear, because of understanding. This wasn't going to stay quiet much longer, and the forest was already choosing who it would allow to remain. The flyer fluttered in the breeze like bait on a hook. Someone had stapled it to the community board outside the cafe, half covered by an ad for a church rummage sale and a missing cat poster that had already curled with rain. Big block letters in permanent markers screamed across the page. Tracking party, backcountry sighting, join the search. And underneath, Duke Ralston's name scrawled like a brand. The locals leaned in like it was a carnival map. There was an electricity to it, that same wild glint that took hold before hunting season, when men wanted to be the first to see, the first to shoot, the first to say they'd stood closer than anyone else. A creature spotted. Evidence whispered. Prints the size of a man's chest. Hair snagged on bark. Eyes in the trees. Evelyn stood across the street, half shadowed by the overhang of the feed store, watching it all unravel with the kind of slow dread she'd learned to trust. They didn't know what they were walking into, but Duke did. He stood near the flyers like he wasn't just stirring the pot. He was setting the table, wearing a vest too clean for real work, binoculars slung across his chest like jewelry, and that half-cocked smile that always said he already knew the ending and liked how it played. Lainey came up beside Evelyn with a paper bag of supplies in one arm and worry on her face. "They're calling it a weekend outing, like it's a picnic," she said. Evelyn didn't look away. "He's bringing ropes. I saw knives too, and one guy had a tranquilizer gun." Evelyn's jaw worked for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. Across the street, Deputy Ross stepped out of the hardware store. He spotted Evelyn and came over, boots scraping against gravel. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I can't stop it," he said before she even spoke. "You could try. I did. But unless someone files a formal complaint or there's direct harm, it's just people hiking." "They're not hiking. They're hunting." Ross rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the growing crowd. "I need something real, Evelyn. Evidence, a report. Right now, it's just stories and campfire buzz. They're carrying snares, she said, quiet but sharp. They're going to lay traps. You know what that means. Ross hesitated. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice low. You wait too long, and someone's going to get hurt or shot, and it won't be an accident. Ross didn't answer, but something in his eyes shifted. He knew she was right. He just didn't know how to write it down. By that evening, Evelyn had a plan, not to stop them. She couldn't. But maybe she could outpace them. She packed light, just enough for a day's trek. Laney followed her through the thinning trails behind the ridgeline. Away from the well-worn paths, Duke and his crew would take in their showboating parade of flashlights and half-baked legends. The girls moved quieter, faster, with intent. They skirted ravines, climbed wet rocks, and took trails Evelyn hadn't touched in years. Paths where the moss still held secrets, and the trees grew thick enough to hide decisions. The air changed just past the second bend. More copper, more quiet. Evelyn slowed. Her boot touched something soft, a loop of cord half buried under pine needles. She bent down, brushed it back. A snare, set low, meant for legs, anchored to a tree root with steel tension. New. Her stomach turned. She looked back at Laney, who had gone still. That's one, Evelyn said. They found another 30 yards later. Then a third. Each one cruder than the last, but no less deadly. Someone had worked fast, or they'd started days ago. Laney moved ahead, more cautious now, tracing steps along the natural curve of the slope. Then she stopped. Evelyn saw it too. A shallow drop, maybe 3 feet, muddy from last week's storm, and in the center, a patch of leaves disturbed just wrong, a false floor. Trap? Laney whispered. Evelyn moved closer. Stay up top. She climbed down carefully, brushing the leaves aside. There it was, another snare, this one deeper, woven with 2 trigger points. If someone had stepped, a crack behind her, then a yelp. Laney! She turned in time to see the girl's foot slip on a patch of loose moss. Her arms flailed, then caught a branch, just enough to stop the fall, but not enough to stop what waited below. The snare snapped tight, only it didn't catch her, because something else moved first, a blur in the shadow. Bracken. He came out of the woods like a force of wind, low to the ground, eyes locked on the trap. He didn't roar, didn't scream, just moved. One hand reached forward, grabbing the wire just before it looped. His other arm swung downward. A stone, sharp-edged, palm-sized, slashed across the line with practiced precision. The trap snapped shut. On air. Laney fell back, breathing hard. Evelyn reached her in 2 strides, heart pounding. Bracken stood there, still holding the rock, still watching the spring-loaded cord twitch against the dirt. He dropped the rock, then looked at Evelyn. Not angry, not afraid, focused, like he'd known this was coming. Evelyn crouched beside Laney, checked her ankle. No blood, no break, just shaken. Bracken stepped back, then vanished into the trees. Not running, just gone. Evelyn looked around and suddenly saw it different. This wasn't his first time disarming a trap. She looked again at the loop, at the stone, at the angle of his movement. That wasn't instinct. That was strategy. He'd done it before, Laney whispered. He was watching us. No, Evelyn said, staring at the point where Bracken had stood. He was watching the traps. And suddenly the memory of that first day came back sharp. The wounds on Bracken's arms, the limp, the broken ribs. He hadn't fallen by mistake. He'd drawn someone away. She stood up slowly. He got caught, she said aloud, so someone else wouldn't. They didn't talk much on the way back. There was too much to think through and not enough safe space to say it out loud. By the time they reached the edge of the ridge, the shadows had stretched long, bleeding over the trees like old ink. Evelyn held the satchel of rope traps in one hand, cut and coiled, the metal anchors clinking softly with each step. Duke would come again, that much was certain. But now she had evidence, something real. And if she moved fast, maybe it would be enough to stop this before it turned into blood. She looked down at the valley. Darkness waited. So did he. The creek hadn't changed, but Evelyn had. She stood at its edge again as the wind skimmed across the thawing current, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and old snow. Her eyes followed the churn of the water, not looking for danger, just tracing the path of something she was starting to understand too late. Bracken hadn't fallen by mistake. He'd chosen to go in. That realization had taken days to settle, and now that it had, it wouldn't let go. She saw it in the way the wound on his side curved, not like a tumble, but like an impact. She saw it in the direction of the tracks, the way his body had angled between two pressure points, as if he'd drawn someone away. And she saw it in the way the traps were laid, one path safe, one path armed. He'd known where not to step, and he'd stepped there anyway, for someone else, the law of the dead. She didn't have a name for it until now, but it was threaded through every movement he made, every gesture that told her he knew what it meant to protect something by offering himself instead. She crouched near the riverbank, brushing a patch of flattened moss. The imprint of a large foot still lingered there, fading but clear. Not his, the warden's maybe. Or another, she didn't know. But they'd been there, watching, moving him to safety, letting her see. The forest hadn't chased her away. Yet, later that afternoon, she walked back into town with the bag slung over her shoulder and her boots caked in pine mud. She didn't go to the store. She went straight to Ross. He met her in the lot behind the station, sleeves rolled, shirt sweat-stained from the August heat. His eyes were weary before she even spoke. "I've got enough to put him on notice," she said, handing him the sack. He opened it slowly. Inside, lengths of wire twisted and coiled, some still taut with tension, others cut clean, hanging limp like shed skin. There were notches on the ends, pressure marks, small traces of animal fur and something darker. "He set them where hikers pass through," she said. "No signs, no permits, no emergency flags. If a kid had walked through..." Ross ran a hand down his face. "Jesus, Evelyn. There's more out there. I didn't pull them all." He nodded slowly. "This is enough to write up an incident. Trespassing, illegal trapping, endangerment. Then write it." "I will." But she could already hear the hesitation in his tone. Law worked in theory, but people like Duke knew how to dance around theory, how to stir dust just fast enough to keep it from settling. "He's gonna escalate," she said. "You know that, right? You corner him, he doesn't back down. He doubles down." Ross stared at the coils of wire like they were snakes waiting to strike. "I won't let him off easy," he said. That night, under a sky hung heavy with stars, Evelyn sat near the edge of their camp and listened. No footsteps, no wood knocks, just silence. She didn't know if that was peace or distance. Across the fire, Laney dozed beneath the wool blanket, breath steady, face flushed with the warmth. Evelyn turned the knife in her hand, not drawing it, just letting it catch the light. The same blade she'd driven into the dirt days ago in front of the warden. A gesture, a marker, not a weapon, not now. When she slept, her dreams were full of water. The next morning, word spread fast. Duke had gone out again, not with a full crowd this time. Just 3 men, no fanfare, no flyers. A quiet hunt, and something was off. Evelyn caught it in the way the clerk at the diner mentioned it. Offhand, but with a flick of the eyes toward the window, like people were pretending not to notice the air shifting. She pulled Ross aside on the edge of the parking lot. "He's moving sooner than expected." Ross exhaled through his nose. "He knows I'm building a file. He wants to get in before I close it. He's gonna do something reckless. He already has." By dusk, she was back in the trees. This time, she wasn't alone. Voices echoed somewhere deeper in the ridge. Too far to hear the words, but close enough for the tension to buzz through the pine. She moved careful, not fast, just enough to trace their path by the broken twigs and displaced stones. And then it happened. A shot. Not loud, not close, but real. Then another. Then shouting. She froze, heart pounding. It wasn't panic in the voices. It was frustration, like men who thought they were being tricked. Again, she crept closer, crouched low beneath a ridge of stone, watching the clearing unfold below. Duke stood with his back to the trees, pacing. One man knelt beside a crushed length of brush, pointing to marks that went in circles. Another cursed and threw down a flashlight. They were lost, or made to feel that way. Evelyn didn't dare move closer. But something else did. Across the clearing, above them in the trees. Movement. Too fast to be wind. Too deliberate to be accident. Duke turned sharply, raising his rifle. But nothing was there. Just branches. Just shadows. They stayed that way for hours, trapped in a pattern. Every direction they tried brought them back to the same downed log. The same broken stump. Evelyn watched the sun drop. Watched the panic settle into their shoulders like a second coat. Watched the confidence bleed away. Then, just before twilight, something changed. Duke stopped walking. His eyes narrowed. He looked at the brush and saw it. One of his traps. Not tripped. Moved. Hung 5 feet in the air. Coiled neatly. Draped over a limb like a noose in waiting. It wasn't a threat. It was a lesson. He turned, slow, skin pale in the fading light. For the first time, Evelyn saw it. Not fear, but humiliation. He knew. Someone was smarter. Someone was watching. She slipped away as the air turned cold. Didn't run, didn't speak. She didn't need to. She could feel the forest moving behind her like breath. Back in town the next morning, Duke was loud again, shouting at Ross in the parking lot, claiming sabotage, accusing Evelyn of planting things. Ross didn't raise his voice. Just stood there, arms crossed, listening. When Duke tried to storm off, Ross followed. "Keep talking," Ross said. "You're helping me build the case." That night, Evelyn stood in her doorway, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. She didn't know where Bracken was, but she knew what he'd done. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't hurt anyone. He'd confused them, turned their own weapons against them, and every step he took was one more choice not to break the world that had already tried to break him. She sat down on the porch, staring into the dark. Some debts weren't paid with words. They were paid with silence, and the way you moved through the trees without leaving scars. The valley didn't speak that night, but it held its breath. A wind pushed low through the hollows, but it didn't sing. The branches didn't rattle. Even the creek felt muffled, like someone had placed a hand over its mouth. Evelyn stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the dark with every nerve lit, tea cooling untouched in her hand. Lainey had gone to bed hours ago, curled tight under layers of wool and fatigue, but Evelyn stayed upright, spine locked, eyes tracking shadows that didn't move. She'd lived in these woods long enough to know when a shift wasn't just weather. Somewhere out there, something had tipped. She didn't hear the gunshot. She felt it. A distant punch of silence that came after, deeper than the air, heavier than the dark. She left the mug where it sat and moved inside. In the bedroom, Lainey stirred, but Evelyn's hand was already on her shoulder. "Up now, dress warm." Lainey blinked, groggy but obeying. "Where are we going?" "To find Ross." Within minutes they were moving, flashlights tucked in coat pockets, boots tight, steps fast but deliberate. Evelyn didn't have time to pack food. She grabbed only the basics: gauze, knife, a small flare gun she'd never used. She didn't know yet what had happened, but her bones did. Something had broken. By the time they reached the edge of the trail, distant voices were echoing through the trees, not the calls of hikers or campers. Sharper, alarmed, commands, the cadence of men trying to keep something from getting out of control. She kept Lainey behind her as they moved closer. Then she saw him. Ross stood at the edge of a clearing, flashlight beam sweeping low. His face looked 10 years older than it had the day before. His hand was gripped tight around a radio, but he wasn't using it. He was staring at the ground. "Ross," Evelyn said, quiet but firm. He turned. His mouth opened, but no words came. She stepped beside him. Then she saw it. Not a body, but a trail. Broken branches, drag marks. A dark streak of something wet smeared across moss and dirt. It didn't reek of death, but it whispered of damage. "What did he hit?" she asked. "I don't know," Ross said. His voice was rough. "He thought it was a bear. Something moved too fast. He panicked." "Who?" Ross looked at her, ashamed. "Duke," Evelyn exhaled slowly. Not shock, just confirmation. He didn't mean to, Ross added, like that was supposed to mean something. He's rattled. He's always rattled. He's just never had a reason to shake. She looked at the blood trail again. Not splattered, not explosive, just smeared in one direction, pulled. He didn't kill it, she said. Or it would have stayed here. Ross didn't respond. Evelyn crouched low, touched the edge of the moss. Still damp, fresh. She felt eyes then. Not from Ross. Not from Laney. From the woods. She stood slowly and turned. Across the clearing just behind the first line of trees. Something stood. Massive. Still. Watching. She recognized the shape even before the eyes caught the edge of moonlight. The warden. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. Every man in that clearing went still. It wasn't fear. It was judgment. Like being read down to the marrow. Duke backed away instinctively. Gun lowered but shaking. I didn't mean. The warden didn't blink. Bracken emerged next. From the opposite side. He moved slow, deliberate, shoulders squared, but body calm. His side showed fresh blood, but not enough to stop him. He walked not as the wounded, but as the boundary. He stepped between Evelyn and the clearing. Then he turned toward Duke and stopped. He didn't growl, didn't raise his hands, just stood. The meaning was clear. This far, no further. Duke raised the gun again. Not to fire, but from reflex. Ross moved faster. He lunged and grabbed Duke's wrist, twisting hard. The gun fell. Evelyn kicked it away. Enough, Ross snapped. Duke tried to push back, but Ross pinned him. That's unlawful discharge, endangering civilians, interfering with protected lands. There ain't no law for this, Duke shouted. This ain't even real. Bracken didn't flinch. He just stared, and in that stare, the weight of silence pressed down. Then he moved, not to Duke, to Evelyn. He walked to her with steady steps. Slower now. Each one heavy with the weight of what had come before. He stopped just in front of her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the warmth of his breath curled into the space between them. Then, from behind his back, he reached for something. It was wrapped in old cloth, small, weathered. He held it in both hands and lifted it slightly. Not an offering, a statement. Evelyn reached forward, slowly. She took it. The cloth unwrapped easy in her palm. Inside was a piece of old horn, smooth and worn, carved with shallow lines. Not decoration, not random. Tallies, marks of memory, a record. One line stood apart. New, a final mark. Evelyn didn't speak, didn't thank him. She just looked up, and he nodded once. Then he turned and walked away, not limping, not slow, just done. The warden followed, and in their wake, the trees returned to silence. No birds, no wind, just the breath of a valley that had witnessed something and would hold it in trust. Ross pulled Duke to his feet. You're lucky, he muttered. You're lucky they have rules. Duke didn't respond. His hands were still shaking. They hiked out in silence. At the trailhead, Evelyn turned back once. No one followed. Back at the cabin, she unwrapped the horn again, held it in her hand like a weight of memory. She didn't place it on the mantel. She didn't display it. She placed it in the drawer beside the old compass, the worn journal, the keys to a truck that barely ran anymore. And she closed the drawer softly. Some gifts weren't trophies. They were reminders of the debt paid and the silence owed. The thaw came late that year. By the time the snow finally surrendered, the creek ran high and fast again, pulling winter's silence back into the mountains where it belonged. The trees stood taller in the sunlight, bark swollen with meltwater, needles shimmering in the wind like a forest breathing for the first time in months. Evelyn walked slow, not because she couldn't move faster, because it wasn't meant to be rushed. She stepped carefully along the ridge above the ravine, where the runoff cut a pale path through the pine. Her boots found the same prints she had followed a year ago, now faded, now scattered, but still remembered. Beside her, Laney moved with more ease than she once had. Taller now, calmer in the way of girls who'd seen enough to know when not to speak. They carried no maps, no cameras, just a tin of tea, 2 clean blankets, and a fire starter wrapped in oilcloth. That was all. At the bend where the trees parted, Evelyn stopped. She knew this place like she knew her own pulse. The slope where bracken had emerged, bleeding and cold. The rocks where the fire once burned, where the air had been cut through with unspoken trust. The same place where the warden had once stood, still as a statue, letting judgment pass in silence. She set her pack down beside the old stone ring. Didn't light anything yet. She just stood there a while. The sky above them was pale blue, streaked with high clouds, the kind that meant warmth would hold, but not promise too much. A few birds flitted through the canopy, their wings slicing the hush like tiny blades. Lainey sat cross-legged on the edge of the ring, running her fingers through the moss. Neither of them said it out loud, but they knew. They weren't here to call anyone. This wasn't about summoning. It was about keeping a promise. Evelyn knelt and began arranging kindling the way she always had. Twigs first, then dry grass. She lit the edge with a practiced flick of the flint, shielding it from the wind with her palm. The flame took, dancing in the shallow bowl of stone, small but steady. Then she reached into the side pocket of her coat and pulled out the object, wrapped in cloth, edges smoothed by time. She didn't unwrap it, just placed it near the fire, where the light would catch the worn surface, where it would be seen. The horn, the tally-marked gift, a debt remembered. She didn't offer it back. That wasn't the point. She kept it where it belonged, with her, but let them know it was being cared for. Lainey poured water from her canteen into a dented tin mug, set it near the flame without a word. The forest around them stayed still. Evelyn didn't expect a reply. They'd already given her more than most people ever got. Still, she looked up and paused. There, at the far edge of the clearing between 2 trees, something moved. Not loud, not sudden, just presence. She saw him standing in the rift between light and shadow, just where the sunlight met the old fir trunks. Not in full view, not demanding attention, just there. Bracken. He looked different, but not unfamiliar. Stronger. The wound was gone now, or at least buried beneath months of quiet recovery. His coat had thickened. His breath came easy. He looked not like a fugitive, not like a creature hunted, but like something that had survived and remembered how. Evelyn didn't move. She just met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. He didn't step forward. But he didn't leave. Then, behind him, another shape appeared. Farther back, leaner, shorter. It didn't linger, just passed through the trees like wind. Small, quiet, gone. Lainey's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Evelyn closed her eyes for a beat. The child had lived. The price had meant something. The valley had answered. Another shift. A darker silhouette moved behind Bracken. Larger, broader, still. She didn't need to guess. The warden stood 1 pace back, just far enough for distinction, just close enough for presence. He said nothing. Did nothing. But the way his chest moved was enough. He was listening. Evelyn reached for the mug and placed it near the edge of the ring. Steam rose in soft ribbons. The scent of dry leaves and pine needles swirled into the air. She didn't gesture, didn't bow, didn't invite. She simply shared, the way neighbors once did, when fences weren't needed to prove trust. Then she looked to the stone, where the horn sat in its cloth, the light glinting against its edge. Bracken's eyes followed hers. He took 1 step forward, not into the light, but toward the space between. Then he looked down. Not submission, not retreat, just acknowledgement. From behind him, the warden did something Evelyn had not seen before. A small tilt of the head. Barely anything, but enough. A gesture not of thanks, but of finality. This chapter, this crossing, was closed. Evelyn stood slowly. She didn't collect the horn. She didn't stow the mug. She left them both there. Symbols not of possession, but of memory. Then she turned, placing a hand lightly on Lainey's shoulder. The girl stood, glancing back once, then followed. They walked slow, not speaking until the trees closed behind them again. By the time they reached the lower trail, the sun had shifted, casting golden light across the ridgeline. Evelyn stopped just before the slope dipped, looking back one last time. Nothing moved. No sound. But she knew they were still there, watching, choosing still to let her go. The months passed in rhythm. Fall settled in soft at first, then sudden. The creek narrowed. The leaves went gold, then brittle. Lainey started talking about school out of state, about maybe going south for a bit. Evelyn listened, nodded, didn't push. When winter came, the stove stayed lit longer. The wind hardened its voice. Mornings began slower. The horn stayed wrapped in the drawer, not forgotten, just resting. The world didn't ask for explanations. Most people in West Glacier forgot about the flyers, the hunts, the stories. Duke moved on, quiet, bitter, bruised more by shame than consequence. Ross stayed. He never spoke of that night. But his patrols got longer, his pauses more frequent. Sometimes silence was the truest kind of record. Then, one night, years later, as spring tried to pry winter loose again, Evelyn sat alone in her kitchen. The mug of coffee in her hands had long gone cold. Outside, the wind creaked through the porch rafters. Lainey was grown now, had her own place in Missoula. Called when she could. The drawer stayed closed until something tapped the outer wall. Not loud, just one knock. Low, hollow, once. She didn't rise. She just smiled. Soft, without surprise. She didn't go to the window. Didn't step outside. There was nothing to see, but something had been said, and that was enough. Sometimes, the stories that stay with us aren't the loud ones, not the ones that demand belief or shout for attention, but the quiet ones. The ones that unfold in the space between noise, in the hush of early morning snow, in the breath held between a question and an answer, in a footstep that never crosses a porch but still leaves something behind. Because maybe kindness doesn't need witnesses to matter. Maybe the truest kind of strength is knowing when not to take, not to chase, not to prove. Maybe there's a different kind of power in silence, in choosing to guard instead of conquer, to watch instead of warn, to remember instead of retell. This world we live in teaches us to value what's visible. But some debts are recorded without ink. Some oaths are made without words. And some truths can only survive when they're protected by quiet. There's a kind of sacredness in boundaries. The ones that aren't built out of fear, but out of respect. The invisible lines between what we want to understand and what we are meant to leave untouched. Not everything needs to be discovered to be real. Not everything needs to be owned to be cherished. And sometimes the most powerful connections are formed not through language, but through action, through the way we show up, through the warmth we offer without expectation, through the promises we keep, even when no one is watching. So if you've ever given without asking back, if you've ever kept something safe simply because it mattered to someone else, if you've ever stood still when the world told you to move, then you already know. Not all stories need an audience to be true. Not all guardians wear names. And not every goodbye is the end. Some echoes come back to us not as answers, but as reminders that what we offer the world, even in secret, still matters. That sometimes the valley does answer, not in words, but in peace. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it spoke to something in you, if it reminded you of a truth you carry, or a silence you've kept, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your memories, or simply where you're listening from tonight. And if you believe there's still space in this world for stories built on compassion, on mystery, on quiet strength, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and helps us grow a community of listeners who know that sometimes the best kind of story is the one whispered between the trees. Until next time, take care of each other and listen close. Sometimes the forest still remembers, and sometimes it waits for someone who does too.